Coming up on today's Locked On Hawkeyes Podcast, myself, Trent Condon, and LeShun Daniels, we get ready for it. It's the rivalry matchup, Iowa State, a complete breakdown of the game, what it's like to be inside the locker room for a rivalry game, and the build-up playing under Kirk Ferentz. We'll talk to LeShun about that, and we'll make our picks, brought to you by Bet Online, all coming up on today's Locked On Hawkeyes Podcast.
Are Locked On Hawkeyes, your daily podcast on the Iowa Hawkeyes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Trent Condon here, LeShun Daniels there. This is the Locked On Hawkeyes Podcast on a Friday, as we are just over 24 hours away from kickoff as we record things here today. LeShun, it's a big one. It's a rivalry game. We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more. But today's episode is brought to you by Bet Online. We'll be making our picks a little bit later on. A little bit of a slow start. We both went 2-3 last week. We got 5 more picks, though, for you coming up this week. Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, where the game starts. Thanks for making Locked On Hawkeyes your first listen each and every day. LeShun, let's get into it. It's a rivalry game. We reacted earlier in the week on Tuesday. Some upset, some vitriol, some anger. In fact, that's where I want to start things. You being inside that locker room and the way that Kirk has built this program. It's circling the wagons, if you will. You know, different adages that are throwing out there. But you guys never get too high or too low. It's something that is a big calling card of Iowa football and what Kirk's built over the last 24 years. What was it like when you guys were facing tough moments, when it certainly feels like the Iowa offense is facing here this week?
Yeah. So for starters, nothing, I don't want to be careful here. Nothing changes too drastically in the way that we prepare for a football game, right? So, back in 2016, we had some rough stretches where offensively we weren't playing well, and just as a team we weren't playing well, right? So when we would go into the following week to get back and prepare for the following game, it wasn't like anything we were doing was going to be drastically different, right? Like, obviously, we're making corrections and we're fixing those things that can be fixed on tape, but a lot of times was, hey, let's get back to the basics. Let's make sure that when we are preparing, that we're taking each moment, each play, and treating it like, hey, this is an opportunity for us to get better, right? So when it comes to game week preparation, even if after a struggling week or after a loss, things don't change drastically, because then that's going to be changing everyone's routine and the way how they prepare for a game. Because sometimes you just go out there and you just don't play well, right? You just get beat, and you're just not playing good, right? So them as a staff, and especially as Coach Ferentz's tenure, right? He's been doing this for a long time. He knows that you can't just switch everything up on the fly all willy-nilly, right? So obviously there's going to be a bunch of corrections that they're going to make. I'm sure they've made a bunch of corrections this week during practice, all the way through today. So they're probably just going to get back to the basics, get back into the fundamentals, make sure that we can do a lot of our base offense stuff, with obviously some wrinkles here and there. But when it comes to the regular game week preparation, that stuff doesn't change too drastically week to week, because Coach Ferentz likes that routine. He likes to keep everything very simple, very similar, right? And the biggest thing for him and the team is, right, he just want to make sure that the guys on Saturday go out there, they play smart, they play tough, and they play physical.
So the Boo Birds were out. The media feels like they're coming down hard on the Hawkeyes. Is that something that Coach Ferentz ever talked about? Did he ever, mention, hey, it's us against the world? Those types of conversations. Was that ever brought up during those difficult moments?
Yeah, a lot of times he would say he loves to use the phrase, we have to ignore the noise, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, ignore the noise, like anything that's happening outside of the building is really, it's none of our concern, right? Because people are gonna talk, right? People have to get their clicks and all those different things. That stuff is irrelevant to what we're doing in the building, right? So the biggest thing that Coach Ferentz and the staff make sure that they get across to us is obviously ignore that stuff, right? And we focus on doing us, right? Focusing on what we can do to get better each and every day, at practice, in the weight room, in the film room, because no matter what, people are going to talk, right? Good, bad, or indifferent. And if you start to listen into that noise and you let that noise creep into the locker room, then that's when problems arise, and now you start creating more doubts and those different things, right? So it's very, very important to make sure that we ignore all of that stuff and we focus on what's just happening within the building and not anything that's outside. So yeah, his biggest thing was making sure that you ignore the noise. Obviously, like, you can't ignore it entirely, but doing a really, really good job to mitigate as much as that stuff and really don't let it creep into the building was something that was Coach Ferentz always harped on.
So, LeShun, we know you like to talk, right? We like to have our conversations here. This is something weird for me. So I started doing a radio show when I was in college, a sports radio show, and kind of directed that. I knew that's where my life, I wanted it to lead. You, though, as a player, when you show up, and at least when you were playing, you couldn't talk as a freshman. You had to wait until your sophomore campaign before you could talk to the media. How about that aspect of it? Because we saw this week the questions of Arlen Bruce asking about Keegan Johnson, what was happening. And you could tell the media maybe looking for a little bit of a gotcha moment, or more than anything, just trying to get some information. How about that perspective? You as a player first, just talking to the media, and I'm going to guess there had to be a class, right? I mean, Coach Ferentz or somebody else had to say, all right, when you're talking to the media, this is what you guys are going to do.
Yeah. There was always like this like media training thing that we would go through, right? Basically things you do and don't say, right? Obviously you always make sure that you're giving respect to your opponents, right? Not saying anything, outlandish, anything that they can use as bulletin board material, right? That was always a big thing. Mm-hmm. And another thing was, obviously, avoid talking about other, like, your teammates and like injuries, right? Mm-hmm. Like, obviously, like if you want to pump them up and say something good, like, yeah, they have no problem with that. But like if a teammate's injured or an out, like, obviously keep that conversation piece of it to a minimum, right? Just basically say like, hey, like, they're working hard and trying to get back as soon as possible, right? Just basic stuff like that. And really just try to keep as many answers just coming straight from you, instead of like kind of speaking for other people, were some of the biggest things that kind of came across. But obviously, like, they can't do the interviews for you, right? Every person's different. But for the most part, yeah, you try to be as political as possible when it comes to an interview, right? If you watch like the interviews from like the New England Patriots, right, they're very similar in the same way, right? They're not saying anything, right? Always respecting their opponents, right? Keeping everything very kind of hush hush on virtually anything, unless the team releases it themselves, right? And I was very similar in that way. So yeah, we definitely did have a media class, and basically, long story short, was just, yeah, keep everything as political as possible. Don't give your opponents to any like any disrespect. Don't like hint at anything that you're trying to do for the upcoming game, right? Whether if you have offense wrinkles on offense or defense or whatever, right? Keep all that stuff to a minimum as possible. So
I remember when I was in school and Fred Barr, he was playing for the Hawkeyes, and he said he didn't like Iowa State. I mean, it was a big one. And he said, I hate the Cardinal and gold, or the colors of the team. Julian Vandevelde, he did the same kind of thing. And it's rivalry week this week, so I'm sure that was also part of the conversation leading in. Don't throw anybody under the bus, and don't talk about the rivalry game. Don't give them any of that bulletin board material. Well, we got some that we're going to give coming up next. When we continue, we're going to break down the Iowa State game. What was it like rivalry week? Is there a little pep in the step for Kirk and the rest of the crew? What it is, the in-state rivalry. We'll talk about CyHawk. We'll talk about the rivalry, and we'll do it as we continue. This is the Locked On Hawkeyes podcast. BetOnline is your number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports information this season. You can find all the latest football league developments, matchups, news, and podcasts, including this week's games. BetOnline, your continued source for all your wagering information, including live betting and a whole lot more. Head to the website today or use your phone, hop on and learn more about the trends and the action that is Bet Online, where the game starts. We'll be making our Bet Online picks coming up here in just a little bit, but LeShun back at it here and talking about the rivalry aspect to this matchup. It is Iowa State here this week. You're an out-of-state guy. You grew up in Ohio. I'm sure Ohio State, Michigan was a big deal for you. And though not an in-state rivalry, that rivalry aspect for us here, it's so different. And I don't know if I've relayed the story. So as you know, I'm older than you. I'm 42. I grew up in the 80s. I was 3 years old during the 15-year winning streak for Iowa. I was 3 the last time that Iowa State had beaten Iowa. Throughout all of my adolescence, growing up, middle school, high school, I never saw it. And then my freshman year at Iowa, I'm sitting in the student section and I see Dan McCarney and company come in and just absolutely pulverize Iowa in 1998 and the 15-game winning streak. And then it really became a rivalry from that point. So a different perspective. But for you, I want to get your thoughts on this. Just in-state rivalry, what it meant inside the program. You've told us before you're playing Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State. You could tell Kirk had a little something there. What about Iowa State week? What was it like?
Yeah. Any rivalry game, anytime a trophy is up for grabs, everyone definitely has to pep in their step, from all the way up from Coach Ferentz all the way down to like the managers helping us out, right? Like everyone's like, anytime a trophy's on the line and it's a rivalry game, like everyone definitely gets up and ready for it, right? And with the Iowa State game and the CyHawk Trophy, right? It's important, especially to the people that are from Iowa, that the Iowans that are on the team. Like it's especially important to them, right, to win that game and obviously prepare that way all week, like you're going to win, right? Because it being a Hawkeye state, right? You don't want to give that up, right? And you don't want to give those guys from out west, right? Some let them have their trophy, right? Let them have their big victory against Iowa, right? Because that's a game that they always get riled up and ready for, no matter how good or bad they are, right? That's a game that's always tough, every single year. So it's very important to, let's see, a bunch of people on the team, and everyone has a big pep in their step whenever we do have a trophy on the line, let alone get to play our in-state rivals, right? So you definitely want to have those bragging rights, because it's gonna suck, right, if you lose and you hear everyone, whether it's your friends back home or you hear other Iowans and they're talking about how's the Cyclone state now and all this stuff and all that jazz. So everyone definitely gets up and ready to go for this football game, even though it might not be the biggest rivalry out there, right? Realistically, it's not, right? But knowing anytime you get to go against a rival for a trophy, especially an in-state rival, it's definitely a game that everyone's going to have some pep in their step for. Everyone's going to be kind of locked and loaded and flying around during the preparation week during practice, from practices from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, right, all the way throughout the week, to make sure that come Saturday that we're ready to fly around and ready to knock some heads.
It's so interesting. So you were on the team in 2014, right? The last loss to Iowa State. I had maybe I just blocked it out of my memory. I have very faint memories. Really, the only memories is Jake Rudock kind of struggling in that game. But looking back, that was an awful Iowa State team. They went 2-10 that year. What in God's name happened that day? Do you remember?
Honestly, I just remember. So I didn't get a snap in that game. Yeah. Right. So everything was already like, blur wise. Right. But I remember offensively, like we weren't great. And there was like opportunities. I want to say there might've been like an opportunity where we were like near the goal line. And we came away with 3 points and we should have came away with a touchdown. I want to say that might've been like early in the game. Mm-hmm. And then I remember that like it came down to the last seconds, right? And they kicked the field goal and the kid missed it, but we called a timeout. And then they went, obviously after the timeout, drilled it after. But all that stuff, like that entire game for me is like a blur, just because I don't even remember like what was going on. I just remember that we lost. And then afterwards, everyone was pretty pretty upset, right? Everyone was not the happiest after that game, right? Like when we got in the locker room afterwards, coaches didn't really say much, right? Because obviously you could tell that they were really upset, and then the players didn't really say much. And then, like the following day for film, obviously a bunch of people got ripped apart. But then after that, right, it was like, all right, back to business. Time to focus on the next team. But yeah, like losing that game definitely was something that was not fun and not an experience that we wanted to go through again. And that kind of definitely showed over the next 2 years after that when we played the Cyclones.
That was the evolution too of Rudock into Bethard. Of course, CJ takes over full time the following year, and 12-0 happened during the regular season. So it all turned out okay. But 2014, there were some rough moments. We'll see if there's any parallels here to 2022. Let's look at the matchup. Watch the Iowa State game, rewatched it on Monday night, and got a feel for them. Hunter Deckers, he can sling it around. He left some throws out there. You know, looking at his final statistics at the quarterback spot for Iowa State, I thought he was actually even going to look a little bit better than he did, but Xavier Hutchinson, that dude's a problem. And you start right there. They got playmakers on the outside with Hutchinson. Jalen Knowles is speedster. They got another speedy guy coming in from Colorado. These wide receiver group, they're pretty talented out there. I guess the question is, Deckers making a start in Kinnick Stadium, his first road start. He did play a little bit last year against Oklahoma on the road in a tight game. So this isn't his first experience in an environment. Playing in an environment, a road environment for the first time, and especially for a quarterback, LeShun, how big do you think that is? And what do you do? I mean, is it just you got to see if a guy can handle pressure until they do it? You really don't know?
Yeah, like you can't really emulate playing on the road in a hostile environment until you just do it, right? I mean, there's not really much you can really do to prepare for it, because you can't really like emulate like how loud and how difficult it's going to be, when you're out there on the field when the crowd is going crazy and it's a third down and it's a gotta have a situation, and now you're trying to communicate with your offensive line and directing them on who to block, and you're trying to get the plays in and all those different things, right? It's going to be tough to manage for a quarterback, right, early on in their career, right? It just is, right? Because it's different, right? And I'm going to be interested to see how their quarterback fares, and coming into Kinnick and it being a rivalry game and state rival and all that hype and all this stuff going around this game, right? And I'm going to be interested to see how he handles it, right? Because now, like Iowa State's trying to win, trying to beat Iowa since 2014, right? I mean, that's a long, long time. A bunch of senior classes that haven't beaten Iowa, right? So, like, it's gonna be a tough environment. But that said, um, you know that they have playmakers all over the field who are gonna try to help out the quarterback as much as possible, right? Obviously, you already touched on they've got some really good receivers. They also have a really good running back who can create explosive plays virtually at any point in time, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how the quarterback though will fare under all that pressure and the crowd noise and trying to communicate with everyone. Because we've seen Iowa make it hard on even veteran quarterbacks, right? Like they did on Penn State last year, right? So it's something about that Kinnick Stadium that makes it very very difficult for opposing teams to play in. But you know if they at some point if they get rolling, right? Like then all that stuff kind of goes out the window now. And now you're like, okay, as a quarterback and as a football player, like I'm good, right? Because now it's just playing football, right? I've been doing
Mhm.
football for my entire life, right? So once you get past that kind of initial shock of the environment, then after that, it ends up just being playing football.
Well, Sean, do you think the offense is going to bounce back? We were very down after obviously the performance against South Dakota State. Knowing the program like you do, are you more hopeful or are you optimistic that we're going to see not a great offense? Look, this isn't going to be Mike Leach and Mississippi State throwing it around 50 times or anything like that. But do you think they're going to turn around and at least look average coming up this weekend?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Like, I mean, there's been times, right, where when I was in the program and we had a bad offensive outing, right, and we came out the following week and we were lights out, right? We were executing on all phases. Then there's times where we were bad the week before, and then even worse the following week, right? Like I think in 2016, like we played Wisconsin, we didn't play very well offensively. Then we had a bye, and then we went to Penn State and got blown out, right? With even worse like offensive output, right? So there are times that happens, and then you have times where we got blown out against Penn State. Nothing really was materializing, right? Then the following week, right? We weren't stellar on offense by any means, right? But we were able to put up enough points, right, and control the football enough to obviously help win a football game against a very good Michigan team. So it's going to be interesting to see how these guys bounce back. I think they have to bounce back, right? I mean, I don't think there's there's offensive performance that can be worse than kind of what they had last Saturday. So I feel like that the only way that they can go is up, and especially knowing that it's a rivalry game and that everyone's probably going to be locked in a lot more than they have in the maybe that they were last week, right? I just feel like they are going to execute a little bit better than they did last week, but I don't think it's going to be anything drastic from last week, right? They're not going to come out and throw for 350 yards, right, and 4 touchdowns, right? It'd be great if that happened, but I don't really see that happening. But I do see them playing much better offensively, both in the run game and in the pass game.
Well, with that, we're going to pick this game. We're going to make our picks coming up. Brought to you by Bet Online each and every week. LeShun and myself will make 5 picks every week against the point spread, and we'll do that when we come back. You're listening to the Locked On Hawkeyes podcast. LeShun, we wrap things up with our picks against the spread, brought to you by Bet Online, and let's get into it. We got 5 games this week. We open it up. Alabama going on the road to Texas. Now, we've seen the Crimson Tide recently in these early season games. So many of them have been at neutral sites. It hasn't been a real road environment for them the last time. And speaking of last times, the last time they lost a non-conference game during the regular season was in Saban's first year when they lost to Louisiana Monroe. I mean, think of that, what this Alabama program is today. They lost to Louisiana Monroe in their last non-conference loss. Alabama, a big favorite. They are laying 20 against the Longhorns. I just can't bet against Saban. Give me Bama, and I'm going to lay the points. How about you, LeShun?
Yeah, I'm taking Bama. I mean, that team that they have over there is fantastic, right? They've got probably the best quarterback in college football, and any positions that they lost, right, from last year, right? They essentially just reloaded those guys because they looked obviously stellar last week with virtually no errors. Granted, they didn't play a great team in Utah State, but it's Alabama. I expect them to play extremely well. Nick Saban does extremely good against his past assistants, and I don't see this being any different.
Let's go to game number 2. We get a little Big Ten tilt here. Taking on the ACC, Illinois at home for Virginia. LeShun, you get the first crack at this one.
Yeah, so this is actually kind of interesting. This is an interesting game to me because, I thought Illinois looked fantastic 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Then last week, again, they were looking really, really good, and then kind of just melted down, I guess, towards the end of the game, right? I mean, that should have been a game that they won handily, and they end up dropping it, right? So I think this is going to be interesting. That said, I think I'm rocking with Illinois and the points. I just feel like they're a better team. I feel like they're going to bounce back from a tough end to their game last weekend against Indiana.
We're in lockstep again. Well, we both went 2 and 3 last week. We just had 2 dissenting, and you got one of them. I got the other, and we are together on this one. Yeah, give me Illinois. I think Bielema going to have them bounce back. Virginia, they were down early to Richmond as well. Good Richmond team from the FCS, and came back and took control there. I really like Armstrong, their quarterback. I just think Illinois, the more physical team, and they're going to ultimately pull away for the victory, laying the 4.5. This one I am really struggling with. Baylor BYU, they played a year ago down in Waco. They won by 2 scores, did Baylor. Of course, Baylor went on to surprise everybody and win the Big 12. I'm really intrigued, though, by this BYU team. I've been doing some research. I'm also invested in a futures market with them a little bit, too. So Maybe that's the reason. I'm going to grab the points. Give me the field goal and BYU getting 3.
Okay. I think we got our first disagreement here. So I think BYU is a good football team, right? I think they've got some players that can make things happen offensively. That said, Baylor, I feel like I've been high on Baylor for a while now. I thought they were a fantastic football team last year, and I think they're going to follow suit this year as well. Obviously, they played a FCS team last week, right? But they look fantastic. Won by almost, it felt like it's like 60 points, right? Where they were just hitting on all phases, offensively, defense, special teams. And I feel like that they're really trying to build on the team that they had last year and really possibly make a push for the college football playoffs. So I'm taking BYU. I'm taking Baylor this week and the points as well.
You got the Bears. All right, let's go to this one. This is my favorite bet of the week. It's USC going on the road to Stanford. USC looked great last week. I rewatched a big highlight package of them. It's like a 6-7 minute piece. Caleb Williams looked like a stud, no surprise. Lincoln Riley out there doing his thing. But the thing they got was 3 pick sixes against Rice. Now, this is not Rice. This is a team with a little bit more of a pulse. And as bad as Stanford was last year, injuries really were a big part of that. They got a quarterback themselves. It's not going to be a great environment. Stanford classes still haven't started. You're not going to have the student section or anything like that. I just don't know if USC is ready to cruise early on. And Stanford, they pulled some upsets against USC. So I'm going to grab the points. Give me the Cardinal plus 8.5.
That's a good pick. I like that pick. And now this one I'm kind of struggling with a little bit because Stanford always plays USC like to the end, right? No matter what, if they have a good team, a bad team, or whatever, right? I feel like this game always comes down to the wire, and there's been some great finishes to this game over the past several years. So I think I'm right there, kind of with you. But USC looked fantastic last week. I mean, Lincoln Riley came in. It looks like a Lincoln Riley offense, right? They're able to throw a ball over the place. Create explosive plays whenever they want. And honestly, I'm feeling like they're going to do much of the same again this week as well. So I'm taking USC and those points. I just feel like offensively that it's going to be very, very difficult for Stanford to try to contain their skill guys and rattle Caleb Williams, especially in an environment that's not going to be, too difficult to play in.
Wrapping things up, our 5th pick of the week brought to you by Bet Online, and it is, of course, the CyHawk game. Iowa, a 3.5-point favorite. The total in this game is down to now 40, pretty much across the board as I look at the Vegas betting board currently. See a lot of 40s, a couple 40.5s. I invested on the under right away when it came out at 41.5 on Sunday. I jumped on that one. Ultimately, though, we're just picking. We're not picking totals here. With 3.5, I got to take the Cyclones, and I hate to do it. Prove me wrong, Iowa. Do all those things. I want to be wrong on this pick, but after what we saw a week ago offensively, Spencer Petras is still going to be the starter. What we've seen, not just last week, but over the last 8 or 9 games from Spencer Petras, until we see differently, I just can't do it. I'm going to grab the points again, as I did a week ago with South Dakota State. Give me the Cyclones, gross, plus 3.5.
So I hear you. And this is probably like the first time I felt like in a while where I felt like I was like in actual danger of losing against these guys. Cause like years past, right? I felt pretty confident going into this game, kind of like regardless of the team, Iowa State has had, right? Just because I'm like, Iowa, they're gonna find a way to get it done, no matter what, right? Offensively, defensively, special teams wise, right? They've done all 3 over the past several years against Iowa State. And watching the Iowa offense last week was not encouraging at all. But all that being said, I can't see Iowa State getting over this hump right now. I still can't see it happening. I feel like Iowa State always finds a way to lose this football game in some way, shape, or form in a devastating fashion. And I feel like this Saturday in Kinnick is not going to be any different. So I'm going to take Iowa in the point. I'm going to take Iowa in the points. I'm going to take the Iowa in the points. I got to rock with my guys. But I also think that they're going to come out and look much cleaner offensively, and really kind of get back to their roots and really get back to playing that Iowa brand of football that we know and love, and really kind of go in and really hold this trophy and not give it up for any reason. So.
Well, LeShun, we will talk to you again next week. We'll recap what we see. I hope that you're right. You hope that you're right. Every Hawkeye fan listening hopes that you're right on our picks, brought to you by Bet Online. Been fun this week. We will do it again with you next week. Thanks for joining us and making Locked On Hawkeyes your first listen each and every day. You can also get Locked On across the Big Ten with Nate Dickinson and Locked On Big Ten. Local experts from Locked On take you around the Big Ten in 30 minutes each and every day. Make Locked On Big Ten your second listen every day. That's Locked On Big Ten. LeShun, feeling good? I'll be at Kinnick, and I'm going to drink a million beers. I'm going to have so much fun there, even if it doesn't go our way. We'll talk to you next week. Go Hawks.